Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today is a Patreon request from Sybay. I'm talking about C418's Minecraft Volume Beta. Well, I guess this had to happen eventually. C418, Daniel Rosenfeld, the artist best known for, well, this official Minecraft soundtrack, is someone who's requested constantly on this channel to get more in-depth coverage. And, hang on a sec, I can't be bothered to commit to this bit for the whole video. There we go. Much better. I have talked about C418 before. Back in 2018, I reviewed his last studio album, Excursions, alongside Ethan Gordon, formerly the LP Club. And I briefly touched on some of my thoughts on his previous catalog then, talking about having listened to all albums he had up on Spotify at the time, though also mentioning I had skipped over Minecraft Volume Beta, because I was starting to get sick of his style and was already kind of frustrated by the excessive lengths of some of his other projects. And I mean, that project clocked in at nearly 2.5 hours long. So of course, when this request came in, I was like, yep, really should have seen that one coming. Heck, I've gotten lots of requests to do a full dedicated discography review on C418 for years as well. Though I will have to say, I'm not sure if I'd really be willing to do that. It is true that Minecraft Volume Alpha as well as Beta are often hyped up to be some of the most well-acclaimed soundtrack albums in all of electronic music, if not just the most, possibly beating out even Daft Punk's Tron Legacy soundtrack and Vangelis' Blade Runner soundtrack in terms of sheer amount of buzz. I'm sure I pissed off a bunch of my older fans saying that. And don't worry, I have a feeling there's some direct inspiration from that soundtrack on this one. But anyway, yeah, I myself do generally like C418's work, but beyond a few releases, I wouldn't say he's the most consistent artist I've ever come across. He does have a few albums I think are really solid, especially his 2012 album 1, which was my entry point into his work, still probably stands as my personal favorite of the albums I'd heard from him, and even one of my favorite projects to have come out in that year. But outside of that, a lot of his other stuff kinda runs together for me. His attempts towards making more straightforward house and trance music on albums like Excursions and 72 Minutes of Fame often ended up on the kind of bland and tedious side. His singing as seen on albums like 148 wasn't really to my taste either. And perhaps most blatant of all, he has a bad habit of letting his albums run on way too long for their own good. Did I mention that the album I'm reviewing today is almost 2.5 hours? Stuff like this makes the idea of doing a full series on him not particularly appealing to me. Now, I will have to say I don't really have many complaints about Minecraft Volume Alpha as a listening experience. It's focused entirely on his greatest strengths in down-tempo and ambient material, has just enough variety to keep listeners interested the whole time, a surprising amount of emotional resonance, and only runs on for a little under an hour, relatively trim by his standards. That it amassed the insane amount of hype it did is not a surprise to me at all, and given Minecraft's status as the single most ubiquitous video game of the entire last decade, it became a common point of entry for hundreds of thousands or even millions of people to get into downtempo music in the first place. And I don't see any major downside to that. I myself also think the album is pretty solid across the board and don't feel like it lost its effect even as someone who's barely played any Minecraft at all, didn't grow up with the game, and only listened to that soundtrack for the first time after already being a fan of tons of other better established downtempo outfits for years. But I'm not here to talk about Volume Alpha, I'm here to catch up on Volume Beta after having skipped it last time. I wasn't going into this project with the most astronomical of expectations. 140 minutes is a pretty massive commitment for any artist, whether they've had a history of pulling those lengths off or not. And I can't say C418's had the strongest track record in that department. I may not have been bothered by the 90-minute length of one, but I don't know if I'd be as into it if it had gone even one more track longer. And the length of projects like Excursions and 148 especially could just be an outright chore for me to get through. Given my general enjoyment of Volume Alpha, I didn't have any expectations going into this that I wouldn't at least generally enjoy this album as well, but I was definitely worried about how well he could actually justify that length, and I may have been procrastinating on this request as a result. But I finally just jumped into it, and after sitting with it for a good while, it turns out I actually thought this was about on par with Volume Alpha. They do have different strengths and weaknesses. Alpha still has a leg up by being a much tighter and more consistent listening experience, It feels like that project was much more intentionally crafted to be listened to as an album. No pun intended. While Beta feels like a thrown together collection of all the stuff that didn't make the cuts. There's a lot more filler here, but Beta also has better variety than Alpha and goes into a little more adventurous territory. Not to mention the standouts here hit much greater heights for me than those on Alpha did. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I do not think this album needed to be 140 minutes, or that there isn't plenty of stuff that didn't leave any strong impression on me one way or the other. This is still a collection of incidental background music from a video game at the end of the day, and probably was not designed for super in-depth listening. As an album experience, I did not enjoy it more than one. That one may have pretty much all the same kinds of instrumental textures, but still has the benefit of familiarity and me being able to remember the melodies on there a lot more easily. But like that album, even with all the filler, I don't think the listening experience here ever got outright tedious in the same way that something like 148 did. My attention may not have been pulled in the whole way through, but neither was I ever really, strongly itching for it to just end already, which is certainly an accomplishment in and of itself. I guess I gotta go through individual tracks then, and fair warning, not all 30 of these actually give me much to say. A lot of these tracks shockingly just kinda blend into the background for me. A lot of pleasant minimal piano pieces or ambient synth doodles and that kind of thing that are all very nice while they're on, but, just don't really give me anything in the way of discussion material. I mean, I'm all for immersing myself in the melancholy brooding of Dead Voxel, or Mutation, or Warmth. The latter had some cool, post-rock noise buildups in there, I guess. Or being uplifted by the introverted but pleasant strolls of Haunt Muskie, Ariamath, Tazwell, or Drayton. That can sometimes have a bit of a lo-fi hip-hop feel, maybe, and can make relatively longer track lengths go by a lot faster than you'd expect. And to a lesser extent, the track Biome Fest, which doesn't really get going until halfway through, but is really nice when it does. All really solid stuff, but I mean, tracks like these aren't precisely sweeping me off my feet. They're just kind of there. And there are unfortunately a handful of tracks that don't really even interest me whether I'm actually paying attention to them or not. See Moog City 2, 11, or Floating Trees. I mean, they're alright, I guess. I may not feel the urge to skip them, but I also feel like the ideas that they explore are done better elsewhere on this album, and I never really got excited when they popped up if I noticed them at all. But not to say there aren't still lots of great moments, as I mentioned before, that could really hook me in, even when they didn't need to. This thing starts really strong, for instance. The ambient synth builds of the intro key remind me of some of the works of the old synth pioneers like Jean-Michel Jarre and Tangerine Dream and Vangelis, and all those. It left an impact on me despite only being a minute and a half. And the second track, Alpha, might just be my new favorite track that C418's ever done. The way it builds up and down over the course of 10 minutes, from lonely emotional piano segments to bombastic orchestral sections, to more minimal synth workouts, and maybe a fairly free-flowing piece, but there's never a dull moment anywhere, and boy does it pack a punch being placed right here at the beginning of the album. Blind Spots was one of the few moments that really seemed to stick with me from a melodic standpoint, really conveyed a sense of comforting warmth that was well executed enough that I actually noticed in the track listing. I was like, ooh, I really like this one. The plinking bell and kalimba progressions of Flake were quite nice as well, even if some of the ideas here were reprised on tracks like Ariamath and developed a bit more there. But this one's nice and to the point and conveys the icy atmosphere it was going for quite effectively, also probably benefited from being the first one in the track listing that sounded like that. I really like the creepy and chilling effects created by Concrete Halls and its slow plotting progressions. Interesting to have a track that somehow could feel warm and uplifting but cold and menacing at the same time. And of those similarly creepier tracks that had some of those rumbling sound effects in the beginning, I think my favorite of those was Ballad of the Cats. Especially the moments in that one where all those bassy analog synths really build up and make for particularly epic payoffs next to all these orchestral swells. That track was excellent as well, and one of my most consistent favorites here. The plunking pianos, music box melodies, and various eastern flutes of Kyoto really stuck out to me from a textural level. It had a peaceful atmosphere to it that didn't sound like any other tracks on here, even if there's a little diversion into these synth organs that wasn't quite as striking. And Beginning 2 was one of the better piano-centric cuts on here as well. Not sure what was so different about it to set it apart from any of these others, but it did stick out to me for some reason in a good way, and I do have to bring that up. Meanwhile, the entire second half of this album had a whole cluster of tracks that stylistically changed things up a lot more than most of the stuff that came before it. Starting right after the track The End, which, by the way, was disappointingly not as much of a standout as I'd hoped. It's 15 minutes of ambient meanderings that do evolve over time, but never really go anywhere all that interesting, aside from maybe that one moment where all the sounds glitch up and I get mistaken into thinking my earbuds aren't plugged in all the way or something. But after that less than riveting track, I get almost caught off guard by following track Chirp, which sounds really openly disorienting. Its strange, mechanically lumbering synth progressions remind me of something that might have shown up on, like, Jean-Michel Jarre's Deserted Palace album. That collection of weird synth experimentations he did as, like, library music for TV years before he'd actually established his true potential and creativity with Oxygen. Might also just feel like an intentionally lower quality and weirder companion to the final segment of that guy's Magnetic Fields album, at least before it abandons that whole disorienting vibe for some much lighter and cleaner sounds in the second half. There's a couple of tracks with prominent chiptune melodies in Wait and Ward. The latter standing out as the better of those two, thanks to actually focusing on those chiptune elements the whole time, instead of just being window dressing in a few isolated moments. Also like the way it has a whole bunch of different segments that all have different emotional vibes. It's like a mini suite of chiptune motifs, and I quite liked all of it. There's also the drunken synth guitar waltz of Melohi, the light and breezy tropical steel drum excursions of Strad that have some oddly dramatic moments stuck in there for good measure, and the straightforward MIDI jazzed classiness of Stal, which might have been a little better if not for this weirdly out-of-place recorder melody that gives the whole track this kind of jokey flair to it that I'm not sure totally works to its benefit, though all the other musical elements in this track are really nice to make up for it. Really good sax solos too. And definitely benefits from there not being any other tracks in the bunch that sound remotely close to it. I can definitely still mark that one as a favorite. The final stretch of this album does sort of slide off a little again, and we finish off with a bunch of tracks that mostly just sound like everything else here. But tracks like Mall and Blocks can still create some playful vibes that keep me invested, and the latter of those two does have a whole bunch of shifting sections to keep me guessing where it might go next. Far is one of the more energetic piano-centric tracks, and I like it, but it's not a favorite. And final track, Intro, is notable for having these humming vocals, presumably from C418 himself, which I wish was more investing than it was, but certainly seems like as good a place as any to finish this thing off. So, I guess that's all the thoughts I have on individual tracks from Minecraft Volume Beta. As for final thoughts, I'll admit I was kind of struggling on whether or not I properly considered this album great. It's, like, just right on the verge of entering into the 8 range. Like, the production is excellent across the board. There's plenty of variety, no tracks on here that had me so checked out to the point of just wanting to skip over entirely. And the standouts on here were excellent and could hit on the deeper emotional level. I wouldn't even say the length was nearly as much of a chore as I expected, and a lot of my biggest issues with this album's construction are excusable since, you know, it is a video game soundtrack at the end of the day. Sure, it doesn't feel like there's all that much rhyme or reason to the sequencing, but that kind of comes with the format, I guess. It's at least sequenced in such a way that the album never feels too samey for its own good. But at the same time, I can't get past the fact that it's also kind of inconsistent, and I just do not see myself keeping the entire unbroken 2.5 hour package beyond this video. I'm probably just gonna pick and choose a bunch of my favorite tracks and leave everything else behind. I mean, as I kind of alluded to before, I did not grow up with very much Minecraft in my life. I've maybe played the game myself like twice, and watched my brothers or other relatives play it on maybe 7 or 8 other occasions. I have no emotional childhood connection to this game as so many millions of people do, leaving my primary association with this game to be just, you know, the lowest common denominator sector of YouTube, and that likely takes away from how well this thing resonates with me as well. But even with all of these factors working against it, I mean, these are just justifications for why it falls just short of being truly great on a personal level, just as a standalone album experience. And I still think it's really freaking good across the board, even in its worst moments. If this guy had been my intro into down-tempo music like he is for so many other people, I'm sure I'd hold this a lot closer to my heart. And I fully get all the people who do find this to be like a properly life-changing experience. I can probably keep an album of like my favorite 12 to 15 tracks or so. 48 minutes of material at the bare minimum, and I'll probably be keeping more like 70 minutes or something. A track listing like this, for instance, could theoretically give me something that would end up in the mid-8 range. So that's all worth taking into consideration for this rating. I may not unequivocally love all of it, but both this and Volume Alpha have become something of modern classics for those into ambient and downtempo, and even at my most hype-resistant, I do still gotta give credit where it's due, so I'll give this the strongest possible 7.7 out of 10, just barely shy of a solid 8, and it's definitely all worth checking out if you somehow haven't already. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, linked to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.